Beginning right before World War II, during the 1930s, the Soviet Union would experiment with night vision technology, but this was extremely specialized and was not widely produced and saw extreme limited use by truck drivers and tank drivers, primarily. Originating after World War II, the first widely produced Soviet night vision system for the military would be developed and named the PNR-1, made by the Geodesy mountain plant based in Moscow. The PNR-1 was made to be fielded by infantry combat units for nighttime operations, thus allowing to be directly installed onto an SSH-60 or SSH-68 based helmet for the soldier to use. The PNR-1 would also come with a face padding to allow use without the helmet for mechanized units. At the time, it would have been very difficult to equip the entire Soviet army with the PNR-1, as it was still very new technology for its time, being expensive, special purpose, and especially heavy to field. This would lead to the PNR-1 to be mainly a specialized piece to be given to sapper or combat engineering units for predominant use. PNR-1 is a Generation 0 unit, making it require an active IR illuminator source to see through, which is why an IR illuminator torch was to be mounted on the soldier's helmet. The PNR-1 would be produced and used into the mid-1960s, where it would then be replaced by the PNR-1AM. The PNR-1AM would be given updated newer tubes called V4, which were more capable and most probably on par with the V1PM tubes from the PNV-57. The PNR-1AM would be made and used until 1991 in the Soviet Union and at least saw use in Belarus and Ukraine. Around the mid-1950s, there were sentiments in the Soviet military that they wanted the PNR-1 to be more suited and safer for mechanized units. A metal infantryman's helmet within an armored vehicle is not always spacious nor necessarily always needed while operating key aspects of that vehicle. If the helmet was not used on the PNR-1 and the front padding was equipped, then it could easily lead to accidental head injuries. Their desire was to update and combine the device with the standard vehicle crewman's padded tank helmet for better protection within their typical environment and to be more lightweight. This in turn would lead to the creation of the PNV-57. The PNV-57 would be used by many countries and well beyond the collapse of the Soviet Union, their main user being the Soviet Union, of course, but would also see heavy use as well as production from some members by the Polish People's Republic, Czechoslovakian Socialist Republic, German Democratic Republic, and many more border states that bordered the West. A little later, around the 1950s to early 1960s, would also see a new piece of equipment rise for actual nighttime combat, when the technology could be made more practical for the standard soldier, allowing for the production and use of the long family of night vision sights fielded by the Soviet military, from the NSP-2s to the very famous NSPU and NSPU-M. This is an NSPU that is kind of taken apart. I'm trying to get it to work. It doesn't work, but disregarding that fact, this is the top of it. Anyway, so, and this would just go on the side of a designated nighttime fighting rifle. So, for an AKM, it'd be AKM-N. For an AK-74, AK-74N. RPG, RPG-N, RPD, RPD-N, you get the point. So, if we were to grab our supplied Kalashnikov, which of course does not have the correct rail, but it still vaguely works, you can just slot it over. There we go. Only took a million tries, which would look something like this, as these types of rifles would be equipped with a side rail that could attach to these scopes, the same side rail that was used on the Dragunov's SVD series for sniper rifles and such. And then you would have this. And of course, with rifles like these, they would actually take off these either a muzzle protector or the slant brake, and they would be replaced with flash hiders to mitigate damage to the actual sight itself. The PNV-57 was primarily made by LZOS, and early production units were also made by the Geodesy mountain plant as a stopgap so that mechanized units within the Soviet Union could move throughout the night hidden to enemy aerial reconnaissance or raids on Soviet equipment while in transit, or for general nighttime maneuvers. Actual night combat was used with vehicle, if equipped, night vision integrated sights and periscopes like the TKN-3, TVN-E4B, and many more, which were primarily installed with Generation 0 night vision tubes, but were later given Generation 1 tubes. The PNV-57 series were originally strictly made for driving purposes. The PNV-57 and its other derivative forms would see main use within the Soviet frontline armored vehicles, such as tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles, but would also see use on boats like naval warships or patrol boats. This version was known as the BNM or BNM-M. The PNV-57 series would also see trials with helicopters, MIA and Mi-24 specifically, during Soviet incursions into Afghanistan. However, the equipment used then in these trials, PNV-57E, was not seen as good enough for the use case. This would most probably spearhead the development of the OVN-1 by LZOS, which was designed specifically for use with helicopters and jets, made sometime in the early to mid-1980s and used beyond the 1990s within Russia. Many logistical and armored vehicles made before 1957 would also often be retrofitted and given the PNV-57 as standard equipment for the crew within the vehicle to use, often given a special compartment or spot in the vehicle. The first generation of PNV-57 were to be issued to logistical and mechanized units and would be fairly helpful during the night. However, to get their intended effect of usefulness, the PNV-57 would require separate sources of IR light, which could be in the form of a handheld torch, but most often had installed light diffusers on the front headlights of a vehicle for the driver. For example, with transport trucks like the GAZ-66 or other similar trucks and small military transport cars like the UAZ-469, these installed glass light diffusers would allow for the elimination of all light produced in lumens but allow the IR spectrum light to pass through. Armored vehicles such as main battle tanks like the T-55 and beyond, like the T-72, would have IR illuminator searchlights installed to the left in the main barrel that moved up and down alongside the main barrel, and a hand-movable searchlight source on the commander's cupola for 360-degree coverage, which was used for the tank sights and the PNV-57. These arrangements would be installed the same or similar ways on the T-72, BMP-1, and BMP-2, BRDM-2, and many more armored vehicles. These PNV-57s would most often be issued alongside their equipment in their purpose-built containers for easier storage and item comprehension for the crew. Later, around the mid to late 1960s, the PNV-57 would be modified to use a power supply unit case very similar to the PNV-57E, with most likely altered electrical components inside to better suit the V1PM tubes and for weight reductions. This version would be called the PNV-57A, and at the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s would see the creation of the PNV-57E, which would also be given out to mechanized units. The PNV-57E would also be primarily made by LZOS as well. The Electro-Optical Glass Plant, more commonly known as LZOS, is still operational in Russia today and has been around since 1935, and its inception was heavily used to create optical devices for armored vehicles, armored glass for aircraft cockpits, and more in 1939 and during World War II. By 1952, the plant had finally gotten the ability for optical and mechanical production. LZOS would be the main force that would outfit the entire Soviet Union's armored vehicles with optical devices, more specifically tank sights, tank observation windows, periscopes, or night vision products like the PNV-57. Then, in the 1960s, LZOS began the production of optical equipment for telescopes and satellites, and in 1964 would begin the production of fiberglass. LZOS to this day, which is now a joint stock company, giving it the name LZOS JSC, is still a leading manufacturer in Russia for optical glass and fiberglass, mastering industry production techniques through the integration of computers in its products since 1992. The PNV-57E, such as this guy, functioned very similarly to the PNV-57, but with new tubes installed that would allow ambient light, such as from the moon, the stars, and natural lights around, to be picked up by the device more easily and amplifying it. The new PNV-57E would also be given circuit boards, which is fairly new technology for the 1970s, allowing for space comprehension, and through that would allow them to add more modules inside the unit, in the back of the power supply unit case here, to better optimize and protect the device. And this would make the PNV-57E more effective and capable to the original PNV-57, which would quickly be ditched after the PNV-57E came out. However, in conditions of absolute darkness, with no background light of any nature, meaning there's no moon, there's no stars, it's cloudy, there's absolutely nothing shown. Not nothing, but it'll be extremely hard for the PNV-57E to pick up any light and amplify it, just like it would be more so like the PNV-57 at that point. Therefore, crews were still given the glass light diffusers for the headlights. The PNV-57E would see concurrent deployment with logistical and mechanized units well into and beyond the 2000s. Both major versions, known as the PNV-57 and PNV-57E, would be powered by the vehicle itself, which, depending on the vehicle, can be set to either 12 volts or 24 volts within the device to ensure it does not get overvoltaged by the vehicle. Later, during Russian rearmament projects to refit the newfound Russian Federation Army in the early 2000s, there would be the modification to the PNV-57E called the PNV-57EM. The only main differences between the two were that the PNV-57EM was given new lenses, very similar to the PNV-10T, to increase visual quality and remove like a fisheye effect. Newer night vision tubes were installed, V8A, which the original ones, like in this guy, are V8 or EP33. That's a different subject. And the transformer was allowed to, well, the power supply unit, was allowed to take two AA batteries instead of using a cable and connecting to the vehicle. So, on the original PNV-57 and PNV-57E, PNV-57A, there would be a very long cord attached to the very back, which would plug into the vehicle, removing that, making it a bit more easier to drive. Now, I do understand real quick that this is not a PNV-57E, but this is completely based off and has most of the original aspects and electronics-ish from the PNV-57E. This was just made for civilian export, but that'll be a later topic in this video. A few countries outside of the Soviet Union, such as the Polish People's Republic and the Czechoslovakian Socialist Republic, would create expansive amounts of licensed versions of the PNV-57 and more broad depictions there and after of it, of the unit to be used with standard infantry units, compared to the average mechanized unit. These units would be more akin to the PNR-1. Both the Polish People's Republic and Czechoslovakian Socialist Republic would be given the technical data packages to produce their own PNV-57 sometime around 1960 or 1961 for relatively both countries, from what I've been able to find. This, by the way, is a Czechoslovakian version of the PNV-57. The Polish-built PNV-57s would have their name changed to PNW-57A. There is nothing special about the name change, as it occurs due to how the Polish language interprets V's into W's. So therefore, PNV turns to PNW. With that said, though, it seems that in East German service, they were also called PNW-57. Maybe they got supplied with the Polish ones. I don't know. Later, by around the mid-1960s or so, both countries would continue to make alterations to their PNV-57s for normal soldiers, thus allowing the creation of the NS-71 and PWN-2 in Poland, and the PNV-57H for Czechoslovakia. Both the NS71 and PNV-57H would be mounted to the standard infantryman's helmet in both countries. The same concept as the PNR-1, except, in this case, being primarily based on the PNV-57. With that said, though, the PNV-57H was entirely a PNV-57 unit just put onto a helmet. The NS71, though, was a bit changed and it had a more unique housing that was made from scratch in the factory. A little bit more unique, but I'll go over that later. Between the two major licensed copies, the Polish PNW-57A and the Czech PNV-57, there are no substantial differences between them and the Soviet-built PNV-57. The really only difference is the outside text being in different languages and the different hammer tone finishes that came from each country. Much later, compared to any of the other countries, though, Yugoslavia, like many of their own military industry needs, would make their own PNV-57 derivative called the M68 made by Zrock, based in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. These would begin production in 1968 and would have Generation 1 tubes installed to them compared to the normal PNV-57's Generation 0 tubes. The M68 would also be made to be compatible with both tank-padded protection helmets and standard infantry metal protection helmets, instead of having purpose-built variants like the other countries. The M68 would see the smallest amount manufactured, as to this day they are rare outside of the Balkans region. It could be also rare due to not seeing many exports. I'm going to believe more so that not a lot were made and not a lot entered to the civilian market, more than likely. Most countries that use the PNV-57s would probably have them taken out of service and vast stockpiles created in warehouses by the 1990s and 2000s. This is why you see a lot of, even to this day still, Polish PNW-57As for sale on websites like eBay and the such. But it has died down quite a bit. But, it was the most prevalent, like 2010s to 2015, give or take. And then they were warehoused because by that point they had become very outdated by then. However, the PNV-57E is still fairly widely used to this day by many countries that operate both them and the vehicles given to them. So, for example, like Estonia or Poland, for example, driving MTLLBs, they still have their PNV-57s and PNV-57Es installed in them. Therefore, they still use them. And only Slovakia beginning to retire them around 4-ish years ago. By around 1992 or 1993, give or take, the Russian company LZOS would have large, vast stockpiles of complete or incomplete PNV-57E units, which they would then turn into handheld binoculars, or in some cases monoculars, but those weren't very common at all. And these were made for civilian export with retrofitted electronics to be more compact, even though this is still fairly heavy by modern standards probably. It doesn't have that huge transformer in the back, and this, I keep saying transformer, power supply unit, and this whole tube right here is the new power supply unit from about here backwards. So, pretty good. And they would also be given newer civilian rated night vision tubes. With that said, though, these tubes are still very close to military specifications anyhow, even though they're just a little bit degraded in some cases. If you really look at the data sheets, you won't see that much of a difference at all to begin with, honestly. And the civilian stuff, for the most part, is not always the case. It can be varied. Is usually given the EP33 series, which is the civilian, basically export version of the V8 night vision tubes. So there's a whole list of them. There's EP33, there's EP33 U, EP33UD, EP33 US. There's a whole bunch of them. Really, not the biggest differences between them all, but they do exist. But there are rare cases where you can find ones with the V8 tube in them. So these guys will always have the EP33 in them, of some version. U or UD, that was the most common one. This guy, for example, this came from this one right here, a Night Owl Optics, I think it was more 25. Anyway, I didn't care enough because I took it apart. But anyway, this is actually a V8 tube in here, which is the military specification one, granted from the 1970s, but can you really be mad? And then also another monoculars, like this one. This is an actual EP33U tube in there, I think. What does that say right there? EP33, yes, U. And not specifically from this series from LZOS, but just in general from that time period, civilian export night vision was extremely huge. So you had all these companies, Night Owl Optics, Tasco, Moonlight Products, Famous Trails, and a bunch of other defunct companies that do not exist anymore, except a few, of course, but a lot of them exist, where they would put in these military tubes, make simplified electronics for them, and sell them, which today is usually, if you find a good deal, extremely cheap. Anyway, the binoculars made by LZOS would be known as the BN series. This is commonly misinterpreted as BN2, by the way. It would have varying degrees of magnification and lens diameters. The BN series would also be given IR illuminators, so this guy right here, honestly not the best in the world. It's 1990s, what can you do? But not horrible. For these guys specifically, it's not horrible. And then later, the next series after the BN was called the BNO, which would have an IR illuminator built into the front housing cover right here. And what's it called? There'd be a new switch installed, so instead of this guy actuating it, there'd be like a rotary switch here that would turn it on, and then the IR light. And then this would also feature similar magnifications, but they were a little different. Later production BN series units also were coined and nicknamed Fill-In 1, and the BNO series would be called Fill-In 3. Both the BN and BNO series would become very popular for purchase from 1992 to 2004 in the civilian US market, alongside the civilian European market, more notably in Germany and the United Kingdom, with a little bit sparser sales in like Poland and such. But for example, Moonlight Products was the heavy exporter of these guys, Russian like night vision for Germany and the UK, for example. After 2004, LZOS had ceased production of these units. I can only infer this as they removed most of their night vision product line, so the BN, BNO, TZN, which is the monocular version, as like purchasable and from their displayed products catalog page on their website in 2004. And this can also be seen from other private companies like Russian Optics, or was it Russian Land, Optics Land, something like that, and like Night Owl and Moonlight, where they started to slowly but surely after the years discontinue them from servicing and purchase. This was probably done as they had either run out of their stockpile or had completely run out, like they were running out of the stockpile or had completely ran out. And, as well, the Russian economy was becoming more stabilized, as well as the company's own profits and retained wealth. That would allow them to go back to mainly pursuing defense industry projects, like in the older Soviet Union times, for Russia and many other countries outside of Russia. The BN and the BNO series would be heavily imported into the American scene by Moonlight Products and Bass. Now, here's the thing with Bass, though. Bass would later be changed to Nighthawk, or the system would go under Nighthawk. It's a whole convoluted thing with them. But yeah, Bass would label these as the Nighthawk night vision like system. And then Moonlight products would label these as the MPN-30K. Weird Bass name, but that's what they chose. It was the 90s, okay? You can cut them some slack a little bit. And that's pretty much that for these devices. The standard PNV-57 unit kit will include the night vision goggles themselves, 2 large IR torches, alongside 2 additional light diffusers, and 2 extra lamps for said torches. A 3-way bridge connector, which has an old Soviet-style cigarette lighter connector on one end to plug into the vehicle, which can come off and turn into a normal plug, operator's manual and service history manual, bottle of grease, which is to be applied on the inside of the power supply unit housing near the seam where both houses meet together to eliminate moisture from getting inside the unit primarily, screwdriver for disassembly, and 2 TSBK1 high voltage capacitors for the transformer. The unit would also include smaller extras like screws and springs alongside other small minor things like that. For both the Polish and Czechoslovakian versions, there are no large IR torches, or not as common. Specifically for the Czech versions, they do not have the IR torches. The Czech versions themselves were just given 4 of the light diffusers, and the Polish versions were either given the same 4 light diffusers or an additional smaller IR torch. If these smaller torches were present, the units should be labeled PNW-57-260. Both the Polish and Czech high voltage capacitors were renamed to CBK1 to their languages. The PNV-57E's kit, however, had most of the same items as the standard PNV-57 kit. This also goes into the PNV-57A. They had the exact same kit. The only difference really was that the PNV-57E was issued newer light diffusers for the headlights. The PNR-1 would be solely made by the Geodesy Mountain plant in Moscow. The PNR-1 would be roughly 7 to 8 kilograms in total weight with the case within full combat capability. Without the case, the entire kit would be around 5 to 6 kilograms. The PNR-1 would use a large metal bracket that would go along the front face rim of the SSH-60 or SSH-68 helmet, and then would be conjoined by 3 leather strips, 2 in the front and 1 providing back tension in the rear of the helmet. At the top of the strap scheme, there would be a metal ring that would connect it all together. This ring would also allow for the IR torch to be mounted directly to it. The power supply unit was to be tethered to the soldier's belt as well. If no helmet was provided, or the user is in a vehicle, there would be a face padding provided with straps, which is very similar to later night vision goggles made around the 70s to 90s, which would allow for greater adhesion to the face for driving. I'm not sure what tubes the PNR-1 used, but at the very least, the PNR-1AM used the V4 tubes. If anything, it was probably the V2 or something similar. The PNR-1 kit would be very similar to the PNV-57. Extra lamp bulbs, extra high voltage capacitors, lens cleaning cloth, manual, and disassembly tools. The PNR-1AM is nearly identical in every aspect to the PNR-1, however, with newer tubes, as before mentioned, and small weight reductions. Nothing really too major there. Soviet PNV-57s could either have one of 2 finishes, olive green hammer tone and black hammer tone. Production models from the Geodesy Mountain plant would be painted in all black hammer tone, while LZOS models would usually be made in olive green hammer tone paint, which is the iconic color of the typical PNV-57. The PNV-57 would be mounted to a standard Soviet tanker padded protection helmet of the time, so TSH-4. All LZOS models would be marked on the top side of the right tube housing with the name and serial number. LZOS examples seem to have never been really given the LZOS factory logo stamp on the device. However, there is a very rare one in this image that does actually show it. So it could be a later production thing. I'm not sure. And then while the geodesy mountain plan versions would have the name, serial number, and the geodesy mountain plan factory logo on the outer sidewall of the right tube housing. All text on the outside will be in Russian, of course. The PNV-57 and PNV-57A units both use the V1P and V1PM tubes, which can perceive IR illuminator light sources up to 1200 nanometers. There'd be a metal plate that leads off onto a small portion of the center column padding to keep it in place on the helmet, while at the front of this metal plate allowed the arm mechanism to be mounted to. This arm mechanism would allow the goggles to be positioned upwards for storage, or to get out of the user's way, but would also allow the user to get better positions near the user's face. With the use of the 3 positions of that arm mechanism, that can be tuned for better fitment to the face. The power supply unit, which is held onto the back of the padded helmet, is held in position with 3 leather straps from the power supply unit case. And then from the power supply unit, there are 2 cables that come from it. The one on the top is the receiving high voltage power cable to the goggles, and on the bottom receives the power from the vehicle you're driving, so 12 to 24 volts DC. The voltage amount can be changed by unscrewing a cap on the bottom power supply unit case, and then under this cap will be a metal bar that bridge connects either 12 or 24 volts. You just change the position in the screws that you screw in, and then it'll allow for that correct amount of voltage. And then once the 12 to 24 DC volts go in, it'll then go through a transformer, and then it'll then be converted into 12 to 19 kilovolts DC. And from the transformer, you should begin to hear the iconic PNV-57 humming. When driving with the PNV-57s, it is important for the crew to first install the light diffusers and then turn on the headlights within the vehicle. However, whenever there are oncoming cars or other types of bright light towards the user, it is important to be very careful and either fully stop the vehicle or drive it slowly. If the device experiences a bright enough light at a high influx into the system, the tubes themselves will either show the light artifacting. This is traces of light emanating from the base light source as a streak, or completely overload and can shut off for 1 to 2 minutes. On most vehicles with light diffusers installed, the typical range given from the headlights will often be around 75 meters of visible seeing length, with people being recognizable around the 50-meter mark. There are not that many differences between the PNV-57 and PNV-57A. The main difference is really that the PNV-57A has a smaller, a little bit less heavy power supplying unit at the back, and the name is updated to show that. The Czechoslovakian PNV-57 is nearly an exact copy of the Soviet-style PNV-57, along with a copy of Soviet V1P and V1PM tubes, specifically called V1P and V1PM in Czechoslovakian, made by the Czechoslovakian electronics company Tesla, which was the main electronic components manufacturer powerhouse for Czechoslovakia during the Cold War. They often even made cockpit panels for aircraft for their domestically made MiG-15s to MiG-21s. Early production Czechoslovakian PNV-57s, made from about 1962 to 1965, would have a similar olive green hammer tone paint applied to them, just like the Soviet examples. However, it seems it was potentially just a slight bit darker. In early 1965 or mid-1965, Czech PNV-57 units would instead be changed to feature a dark gray near black hammer tone paint finish like this one has, with all text being labeled in Czech, with white paint and numerous factory acceptance or information stamps being in the bluish purple tint. There you go, you can kind of see it here on this guy. The device name, serial number, year of manufacture, factory number, and Czechoslovakian military quality acceptance stamps are all in the outer right wall housing on the right tube on the goggles themselves. The Czechoslovakian PNV-57H was designed for infantry units, but more than likely, like the PNR-1 used with sapper or combat engineering units, the PNV-57H was to be mounted to Czechoslovakian infantry helmets and have a built-in IR illuminator torch onto the goggles themselves that went right here on the very front of it and on top of the goggles. The power supply unit would be held onto the soldier's hip by the belt and would allow a portable battery to be used for both the Czechoslovakian PNV-57 and PNV-57H. The storage cases would be a dark metallic gray finish. Now for the PNV-57 walk around. Now this is pretty much the exact same thing as the PNV-57A, it's just the power supply unit in the back here is changed, that's all. Anyway, so this model specifically is the Czechoslovakian PNV-57. Now, as already mentioned, there's others, but the Czechoslovakian is the exact same as early PNV-57s from the Soviet Union, just like the Polish versions of the PNW-57. Anyway, so to give a quick walk around, you have the basic tanker's helmet. Now, I do know, from a little bit of research, obviously, of course, the main difference between this helmet and the Soviet standard and the Polish standard was that there were, these are just fabric flaps, but in the other country versions that I just listed, they will actually have ear cups in them to actually limit noise that goes to the driver's ears, because they're in heavy machinery in a tank or an armored personnel carrier. And then another difference was that on the very front here of the night vision goggles, I'm trying to get a little bit of a good view here, this is one whole conjoined segment of rubber for that covers the optical lenses to, you know, prevent light from getting in while just not using it, to cover the lenses and all that stuff. Now the thing is though, for both the Polish and the Soviet versions, they just used a simple, just like the PNV-57E, which will be a little bit later. Anyway, they used just a single little piece that goes, just a single rubber protector cover that just goes right over it. The Czechoslovakians were the only ones to make a fully encased version that covers both of them, and it's just conjoined, and it's just conjoined at the back here by a simple push a dot snap connector, and that just goes right over. Is that on most PNV-57 in general, the product information, or just all the information, most of the time, depending on country, year, manufacturer, is located right here on the tube housing. You have all this info, whereas other more, it seems to me that it's more so earlier production units would be labeled right here on this little portion right here, or it's this one right here. And then from the power supply unit, which is a big, very bulky, heavy object, this main cord that comes out of it leads to the goggles. This is the correct voltage to run both of the tubes at somewhere around, I believe, what was it now, 19 kilovolts or somewhere around there, to properly run the night vision tubes, EOPs, technically, electro-optical converter. And then at the front here as well, this right here is a 3-piece arm mechanism. So, right, 1, 2, 3, yeah, something like that. So there's at least 3 movements here, or joints rather, that can move upwards and downwards to get a better fitment for the user that uses them. And then at the bottom here, what I really wanted to get this on is this cap right here. On all PNV-57 versions, so PNV-57, PNV-57A, PNV-57E, all that, PNW-57A, this little cap will screw off after some very fine threading. There we go. And it will show a little bridge connector there. Now, this is set to 24 volts currently. These units can run on both 24 and 12 volt vehicle-based systems. In order to switch it from 24 volts, you would unscrew these two screws that are currently holding it in place, and then you would move this bar around to be in line with these three screw holes, and then put the screws back in them, and then it will function at the 12 volts setting. And that's the same on all of them. And then specifically for the Czechoslovakian ones, all factory acceptance marks will be in a very nice bluish purple, I guess you would call it paint, like there. As you can see, the ZVS 68 for your manufacturer being 1968, and the Czechoslovakian military arms acceptance crossed swords. And then there's some other factory proof marks like this. What does that say? I think that's 68, and then more serial numbers just to get a closer look at the text here on the side. So PNV-57, I want to assume you would just say JOW, 1968, and all that good stuff. This, that's the serial number, by the way. So see, whatever you call that, .25-0949. And then this should be, I believe, factory markings, like where the factory was, somewhere at Tesla. And then, really, the only main difference between this guy and the PNV-57H is there's a large IR spotlight right here. All PNW-57As and NS-71s that I have been able to see are all made by Factory 131, embalmed with an oval and painted white. All text, mainly just the name designation, factory, year, and serial number, are all in Polish and painted in white as well. At the very end of the year of production, starting at some point in 1963, there would be an A placed at the end. This would continue until the end of production. If the set was made before 1963, there would be no A from what I can see. I haven't been able to find a distinction as to why this was done. Possibly better quality tubes were installed or retrofitted. If that were the case, you can assume they are installed with W1PM tubes. All this information can be found on the outer right wall housing of the right tube as well. PNW-57A used a Polish copy of the V1P and V1PM tubes known as the W1P and W1PM, while the later NS-71 used the WAY-1 tubes and then possibly had upgrades to the WAY-3 tubes. Factory 131 is Poland's main military optical manufacturing plant that produces a variety of products for the Polish armed forces based in Warsaw, Poland. Factory 131 is ran by Polish Optical Works, PZO, which the main company was instituted in 1921 and later turned into an asset of the state by military orders, and would later become a private company again in 1995. Factory 131 was the main factory that produced military technological equipment since around the late 1940s, after the rebuilding of PZO factories. Most of the factory buildings had been heavily damaged or destroyed by 1944 near World War II's end, most likely by the Soviet military, as the entire PZO company was operated by the German Reich at that time. After reformations from the end of World War II, and now, alongside Soviet influence, They would go on to make many licensed copies of Soviet military technologies. They would not only make the PNW-57 and NS-71 series, but would also make devices like aircraft and heavy machine gun collimators, such as the K-10T series, binoculars, and tank sights. The main PZO branch would also go on to make extensive amounts of products for more scientific applications, such as microscopes, civilian-rated binoculars, and as such. The microscopes, however, is their main civilian product they still sell to this day. Factory 131 is still functional and continues in the upgrading of Soviet tanks and armored personnel carriers, more specifically the T-72 and BRDM-2 within Poland and potentially abroad, with newer generation of periscopes with upgraded night vision, and many more services involving military technologies. In 1995, once PZO became a private company, PZO would be renamed to PZO-SA. Then, later in 2004, PZO-SA would form a new company within them called PZO-SPZOO, based in Warsaw, which would see sole usage for the production of optical products and armaments for the Polish military and for foreign customers, aka Factory 131. Polish PNW-57As were given a near silver gray to gray hammer tone finish, with the ability to be paired with a smaller handheld IR illuminator torch, not seen in other country versions, through a similar bridge connector to that of the normal PNV-57 versions come with. This bridge connector would allow it to be powered on through the same cord that powers on the night vision goggles from the vehicle. There would also be a version of the PNW-57A called the PNW-57-260, which just seems like it comes with the handheld IR illuminator torch inside the case. The device itself will also be marked in accordance with this name change, otherwise the torch was issued separately. The Polish PNW-57A and NS-71 would be stored in wooden boxes unlike any other country. Later, the PNW-57A would be given a metal container very similar to the Soviet and Czechoslovakian examples for later production runs. The NS-71 never saw a metal container and was always given a wooden box for storage. The NS-71 is very similar in function and form as the PNV-57H and PNR-1, which has the same concept as them with regular use by infantry units, alongside a similar mounting method to Polish military infantry helmets, and having the IR illuminator torch on the front of the goggles themselves. The power supply unit would be placed on the soldier's belt once again. On the power supply unit, however, there are two switches. One turns the system on and off, and the other switch will either broaden or narrow the beam that comes out of the headlight IR illuminator. The NS-71 device information is placed just like the older PNV-57 series on the top right tube housing, which displays factory number 1 through 1, NS, serial number, and then A. The PNV-57E and its working scheme is very similar to the PNV-57 and PNV-57A. The PNV-57E would be given a new tanker's helmet to mount the night vision binoculars to, with thicker padding and hearing protection and better hearing protection, known as the TSH-4. The PNV-57E would be upgraded to use the V8 EOPs. These EOPs would be made by Ekron, like most Soviet night vision tubes. On the front of the lenses of the PNV-57E are two rubber covers, which have a small hole poked in them, which allows their use in fairly well-lit conditions. And these holes are meant to let in as little light as possible. However, it should be noted, just like the PNV-57, it is never allowed to turn on the device in direct sunlight during the day, as it can easily damage the device. The PNV-57E would offer the same storage case and have many identical items as the PNV-57. However, the light diffusers would be changed to a thin bar strips that do the same thing really, but are made for different newer vehicle headlights. The PNV-57E would feature a similar power supply unit featured on the PNV-57A with a more refined power output amount of 19.5 kilovolts, just like the PNV-57. The PNV-57E has the same option to allow for both 12-volt and 24-volt vehicle systems to power on the device. Unlike the PNV-57 as well, the PNV-57E also consists of a circuit board within the power supply unit, making it more effective, whereas the PNV-57 used direct connection wires. The PNV-57E is designed to function in light conditions from the ambient sky, moon, and stars in the 3 to 5 times 10 to the power of -3 lux and above. The operation of the device is based on the amplification of weak light from the night sky and rays invisible to the eye, reflected from the road and local objects and transformed into an image visible to the eye. The weak light reflected from the rotor objects is projected using binocular lenses into electro-optical photocathode optical converters, EOPs. Photocathodes have a very high sensitivity to light. The image on the photocathode of each EOP is transformed into an electronic image due to the emission of electrons by the cathode. In turn, the electronic image under the action of a high voltage electric field is shifted to a luminescent screen and focuses on it. Electrons hitting the luminescent screen cause it to glow in accordance with the outlines of objects perceived by the lens optics. Thus, the electronic image is transformed into an EC, the wound of the eye into the visible image, which is viewed by the eye of the observer through the eyepiece. The presence of two tubes in the binocular allows the observer to observe with both eyes with natural perceptibility and a normal perceptible depth of field effect. The M68 was Yugoslavia's rendition of the standardized night vision goggles set for their armed forces. The M68 was made to be compatible with both standard infantry metal helmets and mechanized infantry padded helmets, just like the PNV-57. The power supply unit would hang off the back of the helmet, whichever one it was installed on. Both the binoculars at the front and the power supply at the back would be held onto the helmet with a large leather strap, which is set to a specific size so it can be slid down the helmet any farther than it needs to go. The M68 would be manufactured by Zrock and would have Generation 1 tubes installed. The company Zrock, based in Sarajevo, would be the prime outfitter of the Yugoslavian armed forces relating to optics, such as scopes for the M76 semi-automatic sniper rifles or ONM-59 binoculars made for large weapon emplacements and RPG launchers. The PNV-57EM is a simple modification to the older PNV-57E based system, with the power supply unit modified to take two AA batteries, and the front lenses were removed and modified to use what seemed to be PNV-10T lenses, improving the quality seen through the unit with less to no fisheye effect that is very common on the PNV-57 series of units. Much akin to the idea of the BN and BNO series of replaced lenses, the PNV-57EM was made somewhere around 2000 to 2004, potentially a little bit earlier and potentially a little bit later, to refit the Russian military with a cheap alternative from old units made and used during the Cold War, being retrofitted with new electronics and having newer manufactured EOPs installed, those being the V8A. The BN series of handheld night vision binoculars were retrofitted old PNV-57E units using more advanced electronics and newly manufactured civilian-rated EP33 electro-optical converters, such as the EP33UD or EP33USD, manufactured by Ekron. LZOS would take these old units and modify the original tilting mechanism from the original PNV-57E and remove the arm that connected it to the padded Tinker helmet, making them a regular binocular tilting mechanism. Within the center of this tilting mechanism would be a long metal tube that would be installed. This tube is where the two AA batteries are held to power on the unit alongside a switch to allow power to the unit. In the middle of this tube is also the power supply unit itself, electronics, which amplifies the voltage to the required 19 kilovolts about of voltage, much like the older power supply units from the PNV-57 and PNV-57E systems. On the rear of the metal cap, the LZOS logo can be seen in what version of the binoculars are. Under this housing is a TSBK1 high voltage capacitor and small circuit boards. Within the LZOS factory, they would manufacture new lens housings that would allow for greater magnification scale and lens width to be directly installed within the original PNV-57 lens housings, which all they needed was to be screwed into the main housing. LZOS would go on to make these versions of binoculars within the BN series. BN 1.7 by 48, 1.15 kilograms, BN 2.5 by 42, 1.15 kilograms, BN 4 by 48, 1.15 kilograms, BN 5.5 by 56, 1.25 kilograms, and BN 7 by 70, 1.4 kilograms. The only difference between all of these units listed is the lens, magnification, and carrying bag, as the larger ones, namely the BN 7 by 70, got higher quality, larger bags. The BN series, such as this 2.5 by 42, could be sold with an additional IR illuminator, which is this extra tube right here. On the back, it tells you to turn it on by turning the arrow direction, and it is just simply clipped on there. Yeah, this one right here. I don't know if that can be seen that well, but it's just simply clipped on with a very thin piece of plastic, and only requires one AA battery, so 1.5 volts to turn on. And then along the front end of the tube here of the power supply unit is another piece of plastic that just has the off position in English and in Russian, and at the bottom it'll say on in English and on in Russian, emphasized by the BKL there. Now, for it to be on, just to press that down and it'll turn on. And this piece of plastic also does clip over the tube, just the same way as well. And then for the two main importers into like the American market, but also within Europe, but mainly for America, was Bass and then Moonlight. Both of these companies put their product stickers on the middle main of the tube, often in the rear position or near the front. Later versions, more specifically to the Moonlight products, had a very long rectangular sticker that would be placed on a very large portion of this power supply unit tube. And then at the rear of the main body housing are two clips right here and right here. These two clips are just riveted in place, as you can see here, to just hold a thin strap so you can to allow the binoculars to drape off a person's neck, for just easier holding and just easier moving around with. And then later production units would be called, there we go, would have a name of Fill-in-One on the side tube here. And then seen, it just isn't, it's a hollow piece of plastic with a very fairly thick cut at the front. And then this is what the Bass sticker will look like. It's a very black and metallic sticker. So night vision products by Bass, and I have never been able to find out what Bass actually stands for, but anyway. And for those who most likely don't know, Bass, which was a company name operated by Lane Optics International for their importation of these Russian units, and they would import them until about 2008. But anyway, they would go under the name Bass until about 1994 to somewhere around 1997. I can't really find a specific date, but it seems like around then they would then seem to disband that portion of the company labeled as Bass, and just use the actual like primary holder company title, Land Optics International, through the use of their domain website. They would also prioritize their BN series name to be called the Nighthawk line of products. So basically, on the BAS versions, the Land Optics International versions, they would not usually have this sticker here, and would instead just be labeled as like Fill-In or Nighthawk. BAS / Land Optics International, now referred to as LOI, would use a more simple naming scheme for the units they sold, such as RO-37 being the BN 2.5 by 42. BAS / LOI were also the ones to carry the additional IR illuminator named RO-45, R045, R037. Land Optics International would stop selling their line of BNs by around 2003 to 2004, and would stop selling their BNOs by around 2007 to 2008, but would still service them if a customer needed replacement parts right up until around 2012 to 2014 before they completely stopped altogether. And then Moonlight Products, on the other hand, had at least 3 public branches to their company, a location in America within San Diego, California, one in the United Kingdom, and finally one in Germany. It wouldn't be a far-fetched to say that a good portion of the BNs and BNOs got into the European market through these subsidiaries. It can even be seen today still, as many products that were imported from Moonlight can be often found being sold by German and United Kingdom based sellers, primarily most of the time. Moonlight Products would have their products be in a number of stores nationwide within America specifically, such as Cabela's, Kmart, Sam's Club, and more. Their website would also be called moonlightproducts.com and would be used for much of the 90s to 2000. Moonlight Products in the year 2000, however, would be bought out and wholly owned by Bushnell, the ones behind the Bushnell Holocyte, which the company who made that is known as EOTech, and would later lead to pursue their own holographic weapon sights and become a large figure within the United States military. The TZN series is a singular PNV-57E housing containing only one set of optical lenses and a singular EP33 EOP, making it a monocular-based system. The TZN had 2 versions, TZN 2.5 by 42 for 0.75 kilograms, and TZN 4 by 48 0.9 kilograms. The TZN series was also called Fill-In 2. The B&O series is nearly identical to the BN series, except with the main center tube power supply unit having a built-in IR illuminator and a different switch to turn it on, and the lens housings being more conical most of the time. The switch in the middle of the tube will now say off on IR as well to represent the state, so off, on, and then IR. The B&O series would be made in the following versions: B&O 2.5 by 42 for 1.15 kilograms, and B&O 4.4 by 48 1.15 kilograms. This version of the unit would be called Fill-In 3 during later production runs. I'm pretty positive these names, the Fill-In series, were only put on because it was just for better marketability. There does exist units such as the PNV-57K, PNV-57AK, and PNV-57ET. The only thing special about all the units that I mentioned is that they come with double the equipment. So, for instance, the PNV-57K would come with 2 PNV-57 night vision goggle units, and double the extras to facilitate them both that you would usually see in a standard PNV-57 kit. So, for the PNV-57AK, there will be 2 PNV-57As, and such for the PNV-57ET, there will be 2 PNV-57Es, so on and so forth. These were usually large metal storage cases that had displayed the name of such unit inside, like PNV-57ET. My best guess as to why there are double pair units is to consolidate them to one designated spot to be more easily accessible by the crew, and if ever 2 drivers are could be needed at any given time.